Hello, this is Dana and welcome to my channel, The Orchid Hut. Thank you so much for taking some of your time today to watch one of my orchid videos. If you happen to enjoy the content, please don't forget the thumbs up button to like this video, subscribe if you would like to come back for more orchid videos, and then of course the notification button will notify you every time I post something new. So let's get started today. Today's video is, one of those when things don't go exactly right. And sometimes that happens when we are orchid growers. You know, things don't always go perfectly. So I have two examples that I want to share with you today. One of them is an orchid that I sort of probably kind of already made a mistake on. And then the second orchid is an example of how I don't want to make that mistake again, but the orchid is having a little bit of difficulty, and I'm going to show you something that you might be able to do to buy some time, because this video is mostly about when not to repot an orchid, which is kind of the mistake I made on this first one, I believe. Okay, so let's get the name out of the way. This is Oncidium catatante sunny calipana. And an Oncidium orchid is an intergeneric hybrid between an odontoglossum orchid and an Oncidium orchid. So it's an Oncidium type orchid, but it's an intergeneric hybrid. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the background of this orchid, because it will help us understand why a little mistake here might have happened. So one of the parents of this orchid is an odontoglossum orchid, and those orchids tend to like being a bit more moist, so they like the water, they like to have more water, and they're also more of a cool growing orchid. Okay, now the other parent of this orchid is an Oncidium, and so they like to get moderately dry in between waterings, and temperature wise they're more of an intermediate grower. So it's an orchid that likes more water in cool temperatures crossed with an orchid that likes to be a bit more dry in intermediate temperatures. So anytime you have an intergeneric hybrid orchid like this, it sometimes takes a little bit of trial and error to figure out what it likes best. You know, does it have the characteristics more so of one parent than the other? Okay, so this orchid I purchased over the summer, and its media was a little bit sketchy. So I really didn't like what it was potted in. It looked like it had been potted that way for a really long time. And it already had this new growth. So I thought that it would be okay to repot it at the beginning of the fall. But then we ended up having unexpectedly cooler temperatures, and this new growth right here sort of just stopped growing after I repotted it, and it never ever started putting down roots like a typical Oncidium does after it has new growth. And the original media was like a sphagnum moss that was really, really old. And so when I repotted this, I put it in very fine bark with some little tiny cork chips mixed in. So this was a pretty standard Oncidium type mix. I did keep it well watered, but maybe not quite enough. And I think the cool temperatures stalled this growth. And you can tell by how these leaves look that, you know, it hasn't stayed well hydrated while this new growth was going on. So, you know, it's got kind of wrinkled leaves here, and that's an indication that either, you know, the root system can't support the moisture that this orchid needs, or maybe it hasn't been watered enough, but I really do think it was probably the first situation, and the roots just couldn't support this plant, and then it put on new growth and didn't put out new roots, so then it was even in more dire straits. So now what has happened is that these pseudobulbs have started to become really shriveled, and it wasn't that way initially. And I think where I went wrong here is that I should not have been quite so hasty to repot this. I probably should have waited to see if this new growth could put down roots, and I probably should have continued to water it to maintain these pseudobulbs in a more plump way rather than having them get so shriveled. So now this orchid is a little bit stressed. It's having difficulty supporting itself, and I think when I repotted it, I made these Oncidium type roots just kind of unhappy. I just don't think it liked being repotted. It was probably a bit at the wrong time. The new growth stalled because the weather got cooler. It didn't put on new roots, and possibly its old root system couldn't support it. And it was new to me, and I was trying to figure it all out at the same time. And so now this orchid is going to have to make a bit of a comeback. In hindsight, probably it would have just been better to wait to repot it, leave it in its old familiar media, even though it didn't look great, and you know, wait until this new growth was more established, until I could see some new roots, and then that might have been a better time to repot it. So I think this was a hasty repot situation that contributed to at least part of the problem with this orchid. Okay, now let's look at my second example, because this one could end up the same way if I make the same mistake. So this orchid is Oncidium Firecat Harmony. Now, this name Oncidium is actually an orchid hybrid genus name. It's one of these Grex orchids, and it's based on the parentage. So one ancestor for this orchid is an Oncidium type orchid, and then the other parent for this orchid is, and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, Roncostile. So in any case, kind of a complicated name here, but it's still an Oncidium type orchid. And it had a gorgeous bloom spike over the fall, which has been cut off, but it has not put on any new growth. And it is somewhat of a thirsty orchid. It likes intermediate temperatures, cooler temperatures best, because I did have it in the garage for a while and I could tell that it was getting a bit stressed. So I've brought it in cooler temperatures, and it does like to stay moist. Now, because it's winter, the moistness and the moss that they had on top of this original potting media is beginning to grow the fungusy mold kind of stuff. And that's not great to have in your grow room. It's not great for the orchid, but I don't want to make the same mistake that I made on the first one and just take it out of the pot right now, because it has no new growth, and I do not know if shocking this orchid right now is the best idea. So what to do to buy some time? Well, what I've kind of thought might be a good idea here is to remove this top layer of moss. So let me get a paper towel, and I'm just going to kind of pick off as much of this as I can. The original pot, before it grew all this moldy stuff, was just like a layer of green moss on top. And now that I'm pulling that off, I see that it is sphagnum moss underneath the green moss. So I think there was probably some live moss originally, but it's growing weeds, and it's beginning to get mushy on top with all of this mold. So I'm picking this off. It is exposing some of the roots, but that's probably not as detrimental as uprooting the entire orchid. And there's some in between the pseudobulbs, so I'm going to try to pick that out. You could possibly use a tool for this, as long as it wasn't something sharp and pointed that damaged the pseudobulbs. And I will make sure to wash my hands really well when I'm finished, because I don't want this to transfer to anything else. And as I'm picking this out, I am noticing that there really is no new growth happening here. So not the best time to uproot this. Otherwise I might make the same mistake as I did on the other orchid, and this one will become very unhappy. Okay, so the green moldy stuff that was growing weeds is gone. And that tends to happen a bit more when temperatures get cooler and potting media stays moist. And, you know, air circulation is maybe not entirely what it should be. Okay, so now what I'm going to do to try to keep this from coming back is I'm gonna go ahead and spray just the top of this pot with 3% hydrogen peroxide. And you should see a good bit of foaming here. And it's okay, of course, to get it on the orchid. Almost time for a new bottle. And I want to make sure that it gets in some of the leaf crevices. Okay, that looks pretty good. All right, so now the next step is to just watch that the mold and the fungus doesn't reappear on the surface of this plant. I'm just trying to buy some time until there's a more appropriate time to repot it. And hopefully I will not end up in the same stressed situation as my first example. Okay, so I hope that gives you some ideas of what not to do and maybe what you can do to try to help the surface of an orchid that has a situation like this when you're not ready to repot it. And if you enjoyed this video or learned something new, please hit that like button and subscribe for more orchid videos. Thank you so much for watching. See you next time.